Good morning and welcome to the 16th meeting of 2016 of the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee. Before we move to the first item on the agenda, I wish to remind everyone present to switch off mobile phones, etc., as they may affect the broadcasting system. Agenda item 1 is for the committee to consider whether to take items 4 and 5 in private. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Agenda item 2 is the draft budget scrutiny 2017-18. We're joined today by Rosanna Cunningham, Cabinet Secretary for the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform, and a variety of officials. Before we move to questions, Cabinet Secretary, can I just place on record the committee's appreciation of the level of detail it's been provided with ahead of this process. Previous committees have pushed to get that, and it's incredibly helpful for us in our scrutiny process to have that information. So thank you to you and the officials who would have been behind gathering all of that.
The only downside of that, Convener, is there'll be a great deal of shuffling of paper going on this morning.
Absolutely. That's a price I think we'll just have to pay. We'll move straight to questions, Cabinet Secretary. Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, over recent years, if funding to Scottish Water is excluded, the resources going to support areas of spend in the Eclair portfolio have not increased in line with overall budget. What are your views on the relative priority given to financial support to the environment over recent years?
Yeah, well, Scottish Water, of course, is a slightly different scenario for us because it was partly in a different portfolio. So I did ask for budget lines that excluded Scottish Water for that very reason. I mean, obviously, we're facing financial challenges and there's a lot of difficult choices have to be made. I'm actually pleased with the overall priority which the government has given to environmental outcomes over recent years. You know, policy, funding and cooperation. So there's three different issues there. Expenditure, frankly, is only one measure of the importance of outcomes. And I want to say that I'm very pleased and grateful with the outcome of this year's budget, which I think has helped us by ensuring that we are still able to focus on some of the most important areas that we can be doing as a government.
If we drill down on that a little bit further, Cabinet Secretary, if I want to kind of explore the prioritisation of some of the budget, some of the welcome stuff, for example, as I read it, and it'd be useful to get this confirmed, we seem to have an increase, a substantial increase in the funding for peatland restoration from circa £2 million a year to £10 million for next year. Would that be right?
Well, I think there's a slight complication with the funding for peatland restoration is in that most of it will come from a different budget, which is the rural economy budget, and I want to be a little careful about committing somebody else's budget line on this, but we are expecting to be able to continue to do some considerable work on that this year.
Yeah, because it does appear to suggest that last year's budget heading was actually £2 million a year over 5 years. The 10 million, it would appear to is that it's the 2 million plus 8 million.
Well,
Can I be?
I don't want to be putting a figure on somebody else's budget line. Is all I can say. But I'm optimistic about the step change that will be in peatland restoration.
Okay, and there's an additional spend on woodland creation as well.
That would be from the same source, again from another budget, not my budget, and therefore, while I would obviously welcome any increase in spend on such things, it's not in my budget line, and therefore I want to be a bit careful what I say.
Okay, then, looking at the items that are in your budget line, what was the rationale behind some of the prioritisation that's going on? Well,
I mean, there are key priorities, I think. I mean, flooding obviously is going to be one big priority, and the budget line is kind of preserved going forward on the basis of the completely different way we're now doing it, which I think makes a huge difference because it provides a level of stability and certainty over a considerable period of time on the basis of that Scotland-wide risk management, which is now in place. Obviously, there's a significant amount of money now going into land reform, which clearly reflects the ongoing priorities of this government in terms of land reform, but also the need to make sure that we can fund the implementation of the most recent legislation. It may have not gone unnoticed this morning that the first Land Commission jobs have actually been advertised this morning. So that clearly takes money, and I'm grateful that we've been able to preserve that. And then clearly there's money for climate change. And while the policy direction in my portfolio is where it's held, there's obviously money spent across all portfolios in respect of climate change.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the land fund, there's a very welcome increase in the pot for that. How confident are you that the money allocated to that will be sufficient to meet demand?
Well, with any demand-led budget, and if we're talking about the land fund in particular, then with any demand-led budget, there's a certain, well, I was about to say certain degree of uncertainty, but I think you know what I mean. There's always a degree of uncertainty, and it is one of the demand-led budgets in my portfolio. I'm absolutely certain that there will be no lack of demand. How the demand will play out and play through year by year is what's a little difficult to anticipate, because obviously there's a process that has to be gone through. There's for the first time, we've got the possibility of funding almost like pre-application work. So some of that's a little difficult to anticipate. But I don't have any doubt that the money can be spent. In what fashion and over what period of time it isn't quite so easy to anticipate because it is demand-led.
Yeah. If you take the example of SNH, and the evidence that we had suggested that as part of the budget process, SNH had offered suggestions, options of what could and couldn't be prioritised. Now SNH's budget has gone down. I just wonder, as Cabinet Secretary, how you kind of process that advice to come to the conclusions you come to.
Well, I mean, we obviously have to listen very carefully to what agencies tell us. And I suppose this applies not just to SNH, but to almost any agency. So decisions about priorities at my level have to be very closely informed by the work of both officials and public bodies on budget scenario planning. And there is what was hitherto known as a RAFE delivery board within the civil service, and those discussions took account for, you know, the programme for government, for example, and the national performance framework, specific outcomes as well. So you've got to have those higher level things in your mind. And there is a collective decision-making process for budget that's taken across the whole of government. So I've kind of taken a strategic approach. We've worked with partners who might reasonably be asked to contribute to costs, for example, with SEPA, with Scottish Water, etc. And where we've had to find savings, we're kind of asking some of those with the broadest shoulders and the biggest capacity to absorb savings to share the greatest burden. And that does allow us to then offer a degree of protection to the budgets of smaller bodies, because as you know, when budgets come along, it's sometimes the smaller spending parts that can be the biggest hit because they have the least flexibility. So there's been a degree of protection to the national parks and the Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh, for whom small cuts would be disproportionately disadvantageous. And it, you know, for example, from an SNH perspective, we take the view, for example, that expenditure on outcomes such as biodiversity doesn't only rely on baseline SNH figures, because they coordinate activity, they report progress, They fund some activity, but SEPA is also involved in this, as are the National Parks and the Forestry Commission. So there's CAP money, SRDP funding. It is a kind of complex picture. And there are contributions by NGOs that we mustn't forget about, all of which have basically allowed us to continue that work and to say to SNH that it's not them alone that are doing this. And in recent years, there has been additional in-year funding, for example, to peatland restoration, and we've obviously had that question at the start, and that supports both biodiversity and climate change outcomes. It's quite difficult to pick one thing out and just isolate it in this sort of budget. And that's, you know, for SNH, when we're looking at what the impact on SNH is, you know, we've got to remember that there are a huge number of partners involved and lots of different funding sources involved in the delivery of something which the headline looks like it's SNH delivery, but in reality, there's a lot of contribution towards that.
We'll come back to SNH in detail later. Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I just wanted to pick up one point and ask another question about financial budgets and uncertainty. But when you mentioned Cabinet Secretary about the flood funding, the flood mitigation funding, would you characterise that as demand-led?
Well, I suppose to a certain extent it is, but we're pretty clear that the demand, I mean, I don't tend to put it in the same category as a fund like the Land Fund or, you know, as was the Land Managers Renewables Fund, or they tend to be more traditionally demand-led in the sense that we think of it. You could make an argument that says the flood funding is demand-led, but of course the likelihood is it's probably committed right up to the end of about 10 years because of the numbers of projects that are actually in play now. What we've introduced is a method of clear prioritisation based on all of the work that's been done across Scotland. So, you know, I tend not to put it in the category of demand-led, although in theory, I suppose you could.
So it doesn't really fully meet the demand?
I feel it's in a different sort of category, to be honest, yeah. because you know, I suspect it's one where there would always be a very long list of potential funding projects to fund in that scenario. And what we've developed is a method of prioritisation which has a really good, solid working base through the through all the strategies that have been developed.
Okay.
So to me, you know, I suppose on paper it looks like it fills the same category as demand-led. In practice, I'm not so sure that I feel it is.
Okay, thanks. Can I ask about forecasting, budget forecasting? We're obviously in a scenario now where we have tax powers in the Parliament. That could introduce some uncertainty in terms of the total amount of tax spend that we have. It could result in potentially more spend in your portfolio area or potentially less. What would you see as the priorities for increased spend? It's a bit crystal ball gazing, but
it is a bit crystal ball gazing. I'm not sure that's a very easy one to answer, other than to fall back on what some of the key priorities are. I mean, at a kind of strategic sense, I would say the key priorities have got to be climate change, land reform, and probably the flooding that you're talking about, because that's effectively a kind of at the moment. Most of the flooding projects are about adaptation, some are about mitigation, some are a mixture of both. You know, I think I would always want to ensure that those monies were very much protected, if not increased. Now, I hesitate to say increased because I think the likelihood of there suddenly being a great deal of extra money around is pretty remote. So I'm looking at what are kind of, for me, some of the key areas, and it can be a little bit invidious to have to do that. I would think too that I kind of feel that air quality is beginning to move up the agenda, so I think there would need to be some thought around that. But of course, that goes into another budget line as well, which is transport. That wouldn't be entirely my say. But sometimes, and I think it can be easy to forget that sometimes quite small amounts of spending can actually make quite a big difference. So it isn't all just about the very big budget lines.
And in terms of making cuts, if you had less money to spend?
Well, I go back to what I indicated. I think of the kind of core areas that have to be protected. I mean, the whole natural assets and flooding, I think you would be trying to avoid making cuts there. I'd be wanting to look at how we could avoid, doing less in air quality, because I think there may be beginning to be a real demand that we do more. I wouldn't want to be reining back on land reform or climate change. So, I mean, in a sense, these are all just sides of the same coin for me. And it is kind of invidious. So there's actually quite a lot of extra money gone into the marine side as well, which you'll have noticed too. I mean, in an ideal world, I wouldn't have to be thinking about cuts, but the protection of spending in this budget has, in Clayton, we tended to forget marine because there's been a big jump in the marine budget, have been clear, and it has meant some other budgets have had to be downplayed a bit, and these are all difficult choices, and it's about how you make those choices and on the basis on which you make them that informs everything else. These are hard and difficult decisions to make, but I think with the last few questions, you've probably got a pretty clear steer of where the key priorities for me lie at the moment.
Angus MacDonald.
This may be a bit of an unfair question, given you've only been in post for about 6 months, or just over.
But you're going to ask it anyway.
But I'm going to ask it anyway. Given your previous post as Environment Minister, and given that you're coming in with a fresh outlook, looking back over recent years, what programmes do you consider have achieved value for money, and what programmes have been the most disappointing with regard to value for money?
I think the bet from the 5 years ago, from what I remembered then compared to what's happened now. I mean, I think the flood protection stuff would probably be, for me, if I'm looking at what I could connect from 5 years ago to now, that piece of legislation was brought in when I was still the committee convener, and I was appointed minister during the process of progress of that legislation, and had to switch sides between stage 1 and stage 2, which was interesting. But then I, took the legislation through Parliament, and in the intervening period, we've been able to implement it in full. So that was a really big change in how we were going to reduce flood risk in Scotland. It went from an approach where we just reacted to the last flood that happened towards an approach that looked forward on a strategically kind of based flood risk assessment. And the Act was also making it very clear where the various different levels of responsibility lay, and led to what is now a multi-agency local approach, local plan approach. So that was really significantly different way of working. And it has taken that 5 years to get it all into place, to get the various strategies into place, the local plans, etc. It has taken that full 5 years. So I suppose for me, that's the single biggest, most concrete, positive outcome of that whole period, and an example of how legislation really can make a difference. And some people, of course, will often say that doesn't happen, but I think that's been a really, and the recent deal with COSLA and how funding is to be managed, that £42 million a year, how we're going to have that divvied up on the basis of the strategic priorities that have been properly assessed and worked out. That, I think, is a huge step change in how we manage things. Disappointments, I suppose I mean, that's a very invidious thing, and that, I'm not sure it's budget-related disappointments. There were some things I thought, gosh, we're still talking about this 5 years on. You know, dear, one or two things like that that we just seem to be still talking about. But then I sometimes think to myself that possibly we will always be talking about some issues, that there will never be, in some areas, there will never be absolutely perfect resolution. And to seek that is possibly unwise.
Okay. Cabinet Secretary, I think you referenced about particular individuals or organisations taking ownership of delivery of things. Is that a lesson to learn if you look at what the UKCCC has said about future delivery on climate change, that they need to see a clear pattern of ownership of objectives and delivery?
Yes, I mean, that may, I mean, in some areas that will be easier to do than in other areas. I mean, I think the thing with flooding was that there was some clear ways in which to do that. You know, you had SEPA, you had local authorities. There was a kind of clear path to how to, and it really became then a sense of, well, at which layer does the ownership lie for what? And I don't exclude from that the perennial issue that, you know, domestic householders have also got to take some responsibility about some level of the protection of their own households. So we began to see quite a clear indication of that. With climate change, that's tougher. I think, obviously, governments have to take ownership of it. But what we've not, any of us, any government, I don't think, yet has succeeded in pushing out that understanding throughout all levels of society, including the private sector, that they need to take this incredibly seriously. You know, they're often chivied into it or bribed into it, but that isn't taking ownership of it. And the chivying and the bribing might involve budget lines, but the taking ownership is a much less concrete thing, and it can't really be done by way of a budget. I think there's a different set of issues going on there. And again, that ownership isn't just about organisations, but it's also about individuals. And again, different sets of issues around there.
Okay, thank you. Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and to your officials. More broadly, could we focus briefly on Scotland Performs, the National Performance Framework, which, just for the record, I'll just quote from the notes, aims to provide an outcomes-based approach to budgeting. Inevitably, it's challenging for any government. And I'm wondering if you, Cabinet Secretary, can provide any examples of cases where changes to the national indicators have directly led to changes in policy and the level of resources provided by an agency or a government programme. And I'm just noting that this time around that the carbon footprint is worsening, which is obviously a concern, but there's a lot of good news as well in terms of that.
Well, I mean, on the carbon footprint issue, that we do keep an eye on that, but the internationally recognised way of measuring at the moment is on the percentage reduction in emissions since 1990, and that's what you use to compare with other countries and other regions, etc. The carbon footprint issue is slightly different and isn't the one that is used internationally at the moment, although we're all very aware that the carbon footprint of any Western country is going to be considerably higher than it will be in the developing world. In terms of where changes to national indicators might have led to changes in policy, I suppose one example might be the SNH prioritisation of its own budget and SRDP resources being directed towards improving the condition of protected nature sites, because that was a change in that was something that was indicated to be changed in Scotland Performs. So that would be one example of where an indicator changing in Scotland Performs has actually led to an agency or part of government actually making a specific change in the way it did things.
Thank you.
I could write with more detail.
That-
I mean,
that would be
that's a very broad brush kind of thing.
Yeah.
I could write with more detail if you
Thank you.
if you wanted.
And it would be helpful if you could highlight either now or in
Well-
writing just what the hardest ones are to budge in the way of the National Performance Framework, because I do see it as a very valid sort of structure in terms of the different budget lines, your own and, for instance, transport. if
Yeah.
it's, working together. And I think, in my experience, it's perhaps an underused tool. I don't know if you would agree with that.
I don't. I mean, there are some. Yeah, I think
Of
when
course, I don't know.
when it's whole government activity, that's always a little bit harder.
Yeah.
I mean, you flagged up transport, and clearly there are things that could be happening in a variety of different portfolios that might impact on that, for better or worse. And the joined upness of the thinking then is what counts. And we do a great deal of joined up thinking, and I would argue that we've been better at it than a lot of governments, but we're still not perfect. We're still working very hard at it, and clearly climate change provides us with a big challenge on that. I mean, a kind of small thing that isn't easy, that hasn't been easy to budge, which is a kind of whole government activity indicator, is is people's use of the outdoors. Now, it kind of goes up and down. There doesn't seem to be any steady sense of it increasing. So that would be for me, but that would also be for health, and it might also be for So you're kind of, and far be it from me to suggest that as far as Scotland is concerned, it might also have to do with the weather, or what's been on the telly, and there's all sorts of reasons why outdoor activity might fluctuate. I can't be the sole repository of the actions that are needed to change that, however much we do try. And that particular activity is something that SNH looks to doing something about. Forestry Commission looks to doing something about it. The number of the health boards are quite kind of keyed into that as well. There's all sorts of community care kind of issues around that. Local government will have a strong role to play in that. So it's very difficult to get a handle, just a grip on something like that, and get it all going in the right direction at the same time, across all these different areas, with all the different variables that might be involved. It's life.
Okay, that's fine. Jenny Goldruth.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Just to drill down in terms of those national indicators that Claudia was talking about, we know that biodiversity has shifted from improving to maintaining. But in evidence to the committee previously, SNH claimed that funding issues have not seemed to impact on progress with implementation of the biodiversity route map. So how then will the Scottish Government respond to these changes, specifically with regard to that biodiversity indicator?
Well, basically, I have to take advice from SNH. I mean, SNH are the agency whose job it is to advise me on that issue, notwithstanding that there are a number of agencies like the Forestry Commission, etc., who've also got a role to play in this. It is SNH's job to keep me across this. So I'll be looking to them for advice. And that will include the regular reporting they do to me on any adjustments which might or might not be needed to maintain progress on this particular issue. So in a sense, your questioning of SNH will have answered a lot of that. I can't, at that level, it's hard for me to step into SNH and start micromanaging. We do have an assessment on the issue of the Aichi targets. There is an assessment due from SNH in 2017. And I think you heard some evidence on that. So, I mean, obviously there's probably further engagement needs to be achieved on the biodiversity reports when they assessment has been received. And I've just given a note that said that you wrote to me on the 25th of November about this, which I'm afraid is a month ago, and therefore I don't really remember that. But we are in the process of drafting a response to you on that one in particular.
Potentially coming down the track, Cabinet Secretary, something quite substantial, because in follow-up written evidence to the committee, SNH have said that inability to access EU funding in future will have a significant impact on the scale and scope of works in which we're able to be involved unless alternative funding streams are identified.
Well, that may very well be true, but for more than just SNH, there's a huge question mark over funding right across the board in terms of Brexit.
But this is in relation to biodiversity, which is what we're talking about. So, I mean, that there may be a...
Yeah, but I don't... I mean, I mean, in that sense, it isn't any different to the threat to funding for almost any other activity that we currently draw down EU funding for. You know, there's a degree of certainty up to a certain point. It is a major source of funding for us, and over the piece from our portfolio, from my portfolio, this is not just SNH and but just biodiversity. It appears to add up to nearly 100 million over a 5 to 6 year period. There is match funding required. So you could argue that the match funding will remain as a possibility. You know, but the truth is, until we have some certainty about how that's all going to be managed going forward, I can't give you hypothetical answers about what a budget might look like absent the EU component, because I just don't know. I really just don't know.
Dave Stewart will kind of tease us out in a broader sense on EU funding now. Dave Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Comes out that the Convener's covered some of the issues I was going to raise on Brexit. You could argue, of course, that Brexit is the ghost at every feast and every debate that we have had, and clearly there's huge elements of uncertainty. But if I can draw you back to one question, and that is the potential loss of funding that you yourself have identified of 100 million is a phenomenal sum. Clearly, at one level, SNH have done an extremely good job in the amounts of funding they got from Pillar 2 and on Life Plus, which also is another important scheme. Have you set up some internal systems to look at contingencies to make up for this potentially phenomenal loss of funding in the future?
I mean, you know, we can look at what it impacts. We can then try and consider what we would have to prioritise if there was no future available funding. But the notion, I think, that somehow the Scottish Government is going to be able to step in and make that up is a difficult one for me to consider realistic. I think at the point we are clear about what this actually means will be the point, I suspect, at which there'll have to be a long, hard look at some of the things that are happening now. Some of that EU money is going to be getting spent on requirements to report back to the EU. So there will be some of it possibly won't be needed in that sense if you're into a Brexit scenario, because if you've no longer got to do the formal EU compliance part, then there'll be small parts of that budget which won't be required because you no longer have to do that. But that doesn't take into account, for example, the huge amounts of money that come into research in Scotland from EU, and that, you know, we as a government have said we'll honour the guarantee of Westminster that funds agreed before the date we leave the EU will be supported. But since the leaving EU isn't going to happen until 2019, you're probably talking up to about 2020. And then beyond that, I don't think I'm in a position to be able to answer that.
Yeah, I don't think even the most severe critics of government would suggest that you replace 100 million with your own funding. That wasn't the point I was raising. I'm really saying, have you got a sort of strategy group within your department to look at alternatives for the loss of this funding?
Yeah, okay. I mean, Keith is just reminding me that there is an EU team that is looking across the board, but that isn't specifically focused on this one specific issue.
Yeah.
So it will be looking at this as one of the implications of Brexit, but there are a lot more.
Could I perhaps give a practical example and to help the explanations? Perhaps you can give. I went to a recent conference in Edinburgh which talked about the implications from Brexit with some think tank from Brussels, and their suggestion was a very obvious point when the 27 negotiate with the UK is that there will be bid in the trading negotiations to have access to Scottish fishing grounds. That's a fairly obvious point, and this came from the think tank.
Yes.
Clearly then, thinking ahead as a Cabinet Secretary, the obvious point there is there going to be extra funding for fisheries protection in Scottish waters?
Well, you've already seen increased funding for marine issues in the budget this year, so we're already committing to extra funding there. That's, what ifs piled on what ifs, because at the moment I can't. I mean, I see the debate that is going on, and I've listened to people, and I can see the uncertainties around what might or might not be the outcome of that conversation about access to fishing grounds. And I don't know the answer to that. In any case, that's not an issue for me to argue. That will be for my colleague Fergus Ewing to discuss. Depending on that particular outcome may then depend a number of other things which we would have to deal with at that point. The problem with scenario planning at the moment is there are so many what-ifs that you would have to plan out so many different scenarios. I don't know that at this point is particularly helpful. We may be in a slightly better position if Article 50 is triggered. I can't say at this stage. It's very difficult to actually be able to anticipate. But you can see that there is more money going into marine anyway, and at a point that you might be envisaging a beefed up fisheries protection set up if there's continued access in Scottish waters of some kind or another. I think we'd have to wait and see what it was. When I mean, you're leading me down a kind of line of conversation that we could probably have for quite a considerable while without really coming to the sort of conclusion that would be helpful.
I mean, I totally understand and sympathise with the Cabinet Secretary about the uncertainty here, but what we do know is this is going to happen. We do know that Article 50 is going to be issued under the Lisbon Treaty. We could argue why this has happened in such a half-hearted way, but that's not for this debate today. The mere point I'm making is £100 million.
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money.
Sure.
It will happen. Some of that money will be lost. Clearly, your European team is looking at alternatives to that. I merely put on the record there is obviously worries that the committee have about this huge chunk of money that's not going to be in your budget.
And I would expect the committee to go on kind of looking at that, and we ourselves will have to be thinking very carefully about that, how that has to be managed. And that's got to be consonant with this government's continued insistence that we won't relax standards, that the environmental standards and regulations, that we both apply and comply with, should be continued in reality post any Brexit scenario.
Thank you.
Thank you. Kate Forbes.
Good morning. I'd like to ask about how the concept of preventative spend has influenced decisions within the environment budget. For example, and I appreciate this affects, this comes from another committee's or another budget portfolio, but I'm pleased to see a significant increase in spending on fuel poverty and energy efficiency in the communities portfolio, which will obviously have a significant long-term impact on the environment budget. Can you identify any other examples of preventative spend which will be positive for the environment portfolio?
Two that we've already had some conversation about. I mean, flooding is an obvious one because while some of the works are what you might call adaptation, there are other works which are about the management, and that's a kind of form of preventive spend. It's reducing flood risk and potential for future damage. And I had mentioned a couple of times in passing air quality, because that improvement in air quality doesn't necessarily just come from, actions which will reduce our emissions, because that will be one of the ways to improve the air quality. Improving the air quality will also, in my view, lead to reduced costs to the health service. And I've had some conversations about the impact of poor air quality on, particularly on heart disease, heart and lung disease. I think I'm pretty convinced that that may very well become one of the next big things that we need to be really thinking about. So there'll be a big gain from on the health side of work we do on the climate change environment side. So those are two areas, I think, where there's quite a clear read across. Preventive spend. A lot of the spend, I guess, you do in environmental work is a kind of preventive spend, just by its nature. But those two areas, I think, would be pretty easily focused on seeing how money spent now is actually going to make life better down the line.
Okay. Cabinet Secretary, I realise this doesn't necessarily sit in your remit, but there is an intriguing part of the budget. This is public good advice, which I guess comes under preventative spend. There's a fund of 6.5 million, which we're told relates to what will be in the climate change plan. Can you shed any light on that?
No. Where did you see this? Public good advice?
The budget summary, that will be revealed when the climate change plan is published.
We tend to be very nosy on this committee. Can you shed any further light on that?
Other than that, it will be revealed when the climate change plan is published, no.
Okay, thank you then. Moving on. In terms of managing declining budgets, if we look at SEPA and SNH, for example, and they've had to do that, that has an impact on staff numbers. It requires prioritisation of approach. To what extent do you have any concerns, Cabinet Secretary, that the impact on both of these has been detrimental?
Well, I don't think it necessarily always has to be detrimental. Unless one assumes that ever-increasing numbers of staff will always result in ever-improved outcomes. Now, I'm not sure that that's just as easily read across from one to the other. One of the things that happens when there are budget challenges is that people begin to get quite creative and think about how better to do things. So there's been a lot of work done in SEPA particularly, and that is another thing that I remember starting when I was Environment Minister and was last responsible for SEPA. SEPA began quite early in the process, earlier than a lot of other agencies, to begin to think very carefully about how they did things. So there's been a lot of joint working with, for example, SEPA, and that's led to their expertise coming into the policy teams. So that then helps us again better shape the policy, better communication, and talk to other parts of government and agencies about how they might think about these things. I mean, for example, SEPA began to, quite early on in the piece, and this was, back 5 years ago, SEPA drove quite hard on things like co-location, and that was a big impact. SEPA began to look very carefully about how it did things. We are currently about to consult on better regulation. And there's a potential, if SEPA gets better and better at recovery, then that will bring money into SEPA that doesn't have to come from government. So there are ways in which improvements can be brought about by the creative response to the challenges that they have to meet. And I suppose a test of any agency is their ability to creatively respond in that way. And I think SEPA have been doing that for quite a few years, and proof of the pudding is then in the eating, because they are still in the process of delivering greater efficiency in recovery of, for example, of making sure that that monies that should be coming to them are coming to them in in a timeless fashion. SNH, Chief Executive Officer, is involved in a health group encouraging active lifestyles. So there's close engagement by SNH with officials across the office in terms of planning, etc. So I don't think challenging them in terms of money necessarily leads to bad outcomes. It can often lead to better outcomes.
Okay. Claudia Beamish.
Right, thank you, Convener. Just to further explore the Better Regulation Programme, Cabinet Secretary, which you've just touched on, I think. And you said that there was going to be a consultation. I'm not sure if that's specifically about the programme or more broadly about better regulation. But in the National Performance Framework, part of the narrative does state that there's no budget figures provided for that programme, and some explanation is given about how the scheme will work, expected to lead to better outcomes, but no targets or milestones are included, and no specific evidence is cited linking budget resources to expected outcomes. So it would be interesting if you were able to...
Well, the better regulation that I'm talking about is about SEPA.
Yes, that's
very much
the
about
point
SEPA.
I'm highlighting as well.
In fact, the consultation has actually started, or is it about to start?
It's about to start.
It's about to start. So, I think, given SEPA's success over the last 5 years, I think we have to have some confidence that when they're talking about better regulation, they're thinking about it very carefully, and they're going to work through what look like the very best options. Once we get the feedback from that, will be the point at which we then decide what are the actions that need to be taken and what that requires. I have a kind of high level of confidence in SEPA in terms of this particular consultation. They're driving this forward quite hard, and they've been doing that over a considerable period of time.
It was only
I'm just trying to find, sorry, I'm just trying to see if I've actually got some more information about it here. What it's going to do, the expectation of it is that it will provide opportunities to rationalise the delivery of SEPA's work in terms of regulation. And that will maximise environmental outcomes. And it's actually going to be launched just in the new year, so it's probably just going to be immediately after the recess that you will see that. It's technically called an integrated authorisation framework, so it doesn't sound terribly sexy, I'm afraid, but it's probably worth having a look at from this committee's perspective. And basically, we're trying to make that step change in delivering environmental regulation agenda. It's at one level it's quite narrow, but it has the potential to deliver quite a lot if we get it right.
It was simply that my understanding is that there was no evidence cited linking any budget resources to expected outcomes. Would that be as part of this budget? Or would it
the consultation is being carried out in this year. We will then, having consulted, need to kind of have a look at what would actually be required to be done. And I don't know what the response to that will be. I don't know what that will look like. I don't know what that will require. And so therefore I can't really speak to what potential or not budget might be required. It's going to be about doing things better and more efficiently, though, so one has to assume that we're not really looking for it costing £10 million or £15 million.
Right.
We're looking for SEPA to respond to a consultation and then begin to see what they can begin to roll out themselves. I think we need to wait until we actually see the outcome of it.
Right, thank you, that's helpful.
Okay, let's go back to SNH. Emma Harper.
Convener, thank you, Cabinet Secretary and everyone for coming today. SNH published a recent report to the Government on deer management, and it recognises that there hasn't been a step change in the delivery of effective deer management, as expected. Is the Cabinet Secretary content that SNH is adequately resourced to deliver this step change?
Well, I suppose the first thing I need to remind everybody about is that SNH isn't solely responsible to deliver the step change. The assessment was whether the sector is delivering the change. And of course that involves the deer management groups through deer management plans and any support and or encouragement that is derived from the regulatory arrangements. I think from the evidence that the committee got, from what I could see anyway, deer management work does remain a priority for SNH, and I would expect that to continue. And conclusions from the deer review will inform future resource allocation. Details of the proposed work is still being considered, and there is, in 2017-18, some prioritised spending within that reduced overall budget with a view to at least maintaining the current level and exploring the scope to allocate additional funds where necessary. And there's also the possibility of bringing in money from outside as well, because I mean, as I said, SNH and the public sector are not solely responsible for this. The deer management groups themselves, that part of the equation, I think, has to share some of this.
I guess that has to take place in a managed and anticipated way.
Sure.
And we took evidence from the DMGs that almost out of nowhere they were left to find £60,000 to fund a particular work stream. So there does appear to be a degree of disconnect there in approach.
Well, I mean, I suppose one can characterise an expectation of money being found in many different ways. I don't want to prejudge the Scottish Government response to the review itself, and I'm conscious that the committee has been taking evidence and will be getting slightly different takes on it depending on who they speak to. Maybe more than slightly different depending on who they speak to. But, I'm not sure. The timescale of the expectation or the expectation, what is the issue? I would have anticipated that at some point one might expect the deer managers themselves to be contributing to some of this, but it can't be entirely expected that government, whether central government or through its agencies, take the entire burden of this whole process. So,
I think the evidence we had was that there was a particular work stream that they did take over, and they had perhaps that had been expected. There was another one that they were essentially told, we can't do this because of cuts in our budget, and they've had to find £60,000. I just make the point that sometimes springing something on the private sector isn't always the best way to work. Although I recognise you don't micromanage SNH. Alexander Burnett.
Thank you very much, Convener. And still on SNH, more about the operation of it rather than the actual programmes, and certainly taking on board the fact that you can't micromanage SNH. But looking at some of their figures that they've submitted in terms of whether it's the contracted out services, payroll services, the internal audit budget being completely removed, and legal services quadrupling over the last 5 years. What kind of conversations do you have with them? What scrutiny are you able to do? Appreciating you can't drill down to every pound in the agency. what kind of conversations do you have with them, and do you have a confidence that they're making the right decisions of how better to do things with less?
I do, and you're right. I mean, I do have regular meetings with the chair and the chief executive, but they aren't going to drill down at this level of decision making that you're talking about. There is an expectation that they too, along with any other of our agencies, look very carefully at how they manage their business. For example, SNH do co-locate with SEPA in Inverness. Now, that wasn't the case once upon a time. There is decision-making that goes on to try and ensure that they can continue to deliver what they need to deliver. It would be more likely to come up to me as an issue in the context of a kind of subject area, rather than anything else. So that, I would be inclined. So, if I speak to them, for example, about deer management and the deer review, do I hear then about some of the issues that might arise out of decision making over money? Yes, I might. That would be the point at which it would tend to be part of the conversation, rather than me having quarterly budget meetings with SNH, which we don't actually do with any of our agencies and wouldn't really be appropriate.
Could I just add to that? In terms of the sponsorship relationship that we have with bodies like SNH, at official level we have regular liaison meetings, both on financial matters and on policy issues. And we try and get the balance right between not micromanaging an organisation, which has a board and a chief executive and so on, but providing a strategic framework, set of priorities, and of course they do discuss issues that around particular funding challenges that they may have. So sometimes there are in-year budget adjustments to try and help with that, and that's an ongoing project throughout each year and part of normal arrangements between the government and its sponsored bodies.
Okay, Mark Ruskell.
So just to follow up on that, have those in-year discussions covered potentially more powers coming to SNH over deer management, particularly under the Land Reform Act, and what the implications might be for the organisation in taking on those powers?
I think you're trying to get me to respond to the deer review, and I'm going to do that formally in January, so I think that's probably best left there.
I think what Mark Ruskell's driving...
Sorry, in terms of but I mean, surely options might have been discussed without, effectively announcing the deer review today. There are options there. There are options in legislation. So, I mean, have those been discussed with SNH as a potential direction that government may go with those powers? Well,
I mean, SNH will know that these are all potential directions. Yeah. Whether I have discussed with them at that level, no. I mean, because I need to take a view. I'm watching with interest the work of the committee on this, and the committee's work will inform us as well. And then I will take a view about what response is needed at that point.
But I think not to put words in Mark Ruskell's mouth, and I think this is what he's driving at, if those powers were taken on, there may be resource implications for their implementation. So what scope, what wriggle room is there to fund that?
Well, again, there may or might not be resource implications. I don't know until we actually make the kind of response. And I'm not, again, don't want to get drawn into a set of what-if scenario planning, because once we've looked at the whole thing and all the evidence that the committee's taken and had the conversations at that point, then I will come to a decision about what is needed. When I have done that, we will then look at whether or not there is a requirement for additional funding or otherwise. But I can't say. I mean, that's how it would normally be done. I mean, if I direct SNH to do something, then they will go away and work out how they can do it. If it does need an adjustment in some way, shape, or form, then we discuss it at that point. But that really is dependent entirely on what it is that we choose to do. I mean, for example, if you choose to go down the road of legislation, then you're some years down the line before the consequences of that legislation actually become concrete.
I think it's just clarity about whether it's been factored into this year's budget, and it's clear
Well,
it hasn't been at this point.
No, well,
So-
2017-18, in its specifics, no, because there hasn't been a government response. But 2017-18, you know, will be a year in which there may or may not then require to be some kind of financial response. Well, to more than just this, any number of things that might arise that you may want to have some thought given to. I mean, that happens in any single year of budget. There are what are known as in-year transfers. That's not an unusual thing to happen. And that this kind of thing is what they might be about. I wouldn't anticipate anything, even if there were a requirement for it. I don't anticipate it being a massive amount of money, though.
Okay. Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. So, without in any way looking to future possibilities for deer management, which I obviously respect what you've said, Cabinet Secretary, that there wouldn't be any concerns. Could I rather just seek reassurance about there's no concern about SNH's ability to go towards a Section 8 if that was necessary in terms of funding, as things stand at the moment with legislation?
I don't think that's a funding issue.
Thank you.
Okay?
Right.
Okay.
That's very helpful. So, as you'll know, we're looking at, particularly at SEPA and SNH and Marine Scotland in our budget deliberations, though not exclusively.
I'm beginning to feel like I've got a nest here. Which one are we going to do first?
I'm moving on to Marine Scotland. It's already been touched on this morning that there is a significant increase in Marine Scotland, which of course in that budget, which is very welcome. In the level 3 funding comment, it does say that the budget increase incorporates funding to support salmon conservation compensation measures, allocations for corporate recharge, which I take it doesn't mean anything to do with a holiday break for us all, but I'm not quite sure what it does mean, so that would be helpful to know. And the Ellis building sorry, the print's very small, remedial actions. Now,
So where are you reading this from?
just from the, I'm looking at the level 3 information that we were given yesterday on Marine Scotland, which gives more of a breakdown of what.
It's also more of a breakdown than I've got in front of me,
I mean,
which is what I've just no, because I've got.
It would be helpful maybe if you wanted to write to the committee about that. If that's...
Sorry. Just you'll appreciate the kind of late notice that you got is also late notice for me.
Could we just leave it? It'd be helpful just to have something written about that.
We don't have time for that. To get
Right,
on
is
the
this the same
Oh, right,
text?
we
as
don't have
every-
time.
Right.
No, so it's getting very
And
cut.
just related to
sorry,
that.
Sorry, what I meant was for writing back to the committee. We have a very tight process. Any light you could shed, Cabinet Secretary, today would
It's
be
also
welcome.
just related to the fact that in that level 3, it doesn't highlight anything about the National Marine Plan and regional plans, which obviously aren't going to be completely funded through Marine Scotland, but which Marine Scotland will be making a contribution to, and just to highlight that to you as well.
But this text is just the changes in the budget. It's not really the what it does. And my level 4 isn't set out in that way either.
Right.
My level 4 is set out in capital expenditure, income, EC current receipts, which are another form of income,
Yeah.
monthly pay, depreciation. For Marine Scotland, the agency, I think there's maybe, remember that SNH does quite a lot of marine environment work as well. So this is about
what
Marine
was the
Scotland as
justification
opposed
for
to...
the increase to Marine Scotland? What do you anticipate that increase is going to deliver? What justified it?
Well, I know that some of it is technical, right? What we're what we're hoping for, I suppose, is that it will prioritise its broad remit. We need to get a clearer sense of what the priorities are. There will be efficiency savings will need to go in, and we want to make sure that they're in the right place in terms of income generation as well. So some of the same issues applied to SEPA and that SEPA have been working on for some considerable time, we want Marine Scotland to do. You know, there are some one-off pressures that there have been involved as well, that are about building repairs, etc. So it isn't necessarily a kind of anything different to the same strategic direction that we would be looking for others. But there's been
Is it to any degree an increasing workload that's a factor in this?
No. I mean, there's a 6.5 million resource increase to manage one-off pressures. So this might, I don't know, and I don't want to get into what ifs, but it might not look like this next year, if you see what I mean. So the Ellis building has needed a lot of repair. So
thank you, that helps. I was just trying to clarify really that in what I have in front of me, it's very encouraging to see that the budget also supports, to state the obvious, but just to read it out, the work of the management measures for the network of marine protected areas, which is something new and very important for our rural, remote coastal communities.
Yeah.
But the point I really wanted to highlight was just some reassurance that the National Marine Plan and the regional marine plans, which the committee's heard quite a lot of concern about in relation to taking those forward beyond the 2 pilot schemes at the moment, that there'll be support for.
Yes.
There's room for support for that.
There is.
Okay, thank you. Mark Ruskell.
Thanks, Convener. I'd like to turn to research. There are a few figures in here, particularly in level 4, which are a bit concerning. We've got a 6% reduction in the programmes of research in terms of resource funding. And then on contract research funding, it's going to go down by almost a quarter in the next year. And it does seem to be, Cabinet Secretary, part of a trend of gradually reducing budgets for research. We've seen a 13% reduction over the last 4 years, for example. Now, I appreciate, the points you made about better regulation and move towards doing things differently, but how do you intend to mitigate some of the effects of those declining resource budgets for research? Or do you not see there being an impact?
Well, I need to take you back to the earlier conversations about priorities as well, and some of the bits of the budget that I've had to protect and wanted to protect. That means there are consequences and decisions have to be made elsewhere because there isn't extra money to go to everybody. So the majority of the research money goes to the Morden, to James Hutton, to the SRUC and the Rowett. So they use that money to lever in the additional funding from the research councils, from the UK government, from other public and private funders, and they also operate successful commercial subsidiaries. So I think there is more work that can be done in there, and I have been meeting the research providers quite consistently over the last wee while because of the big threat there comes from withdrawal of EU funding down the line. So there's a big conversation to be had with them about perhaps some of the focus and some of the decision-making that they have and potential ways they can begin to realise some efficiencies out of their work. And that will continue, and the potential commercial subsidiaries are very important to all of that. I think that, I don't know, I don't want to step too much into the university side because doesn't really sit with me. It's the research providers that sit with me. There is research done via Marine Scotland as well as SEPA as SNH, so it isn't just the key research providers. Again, we're looking to try and ensure that where possible, we can lever in money from other places. There are other potential funders out there, and there needs to be just a bit of work done into how we can begin to access that. The interesting conversation that I had with the research providers recently said that they are, understandably, because one of the main sources of funding has come from the EU, they are very focused on that, and they need to start thinking about beyond the EU for other sources of research funding. And I'm talking to them and encouraging them along these lines. So what we're hoping for is a bit of a step change in that to help mitigate some of the decisions that we've had to make and some of the other likely impacts of the Brexit scenario that we've talked about earlier.
Can I just push you though on a couple of examples in terms of the need for independent research as it relates to enforcement? So, Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned earlier on about enforcement of Section 8 agreements, and I think some of the evidence we had in this committee from SNH suggests that data and independent research is extremely important in terms of securing a robust Section 8 agreement. That has been a concern. So there's an area where we need perhaps more research. We also heard in earlier evidence about SEPA and SEPA's reliance on commercial data coming from the aquaculture industry to inform its own decisions around enforcement and licensing. I think with both those issues, is there not a concern around the independence of research data if government is increasingly in a position where it's unable to fund that?
Well, but there's also an issue for both SNH and SEPA to prioritise make decisions about the research they are conducting as to in terms of its. I mean, there are prioritisation hierarchies wherever you look and at whichever level. So I would expect them to look very carefully at what they do and how they do it and decide which has to be prioritised. And if that kind of data collection and research is considered to be the highest priority, then I would anticipate that they will take the resources they have and apply them on that basis. But that will have to be a decision that they make.
Are you confident, Cabinet Secretary, that the capacity will be there? Because in relation to SEPA, we know that they've shut a number of laboratories in recent years.
They didn't shut.
Is your kind of view that with the better regulation agenda, that the data that SEPA will have will be robust,
I'm absolutely confident. I mean, the laboratory programme was about maximising what they had, rather than, I think there were 8 different labs across, was it 8? 7 different labs across Scotland, and they've consolidated into 2. And I doubt whether they would have seen any, depreciation in the ability of their work to deliver what it needs to deliver. It's been done in a better way, managed more efficiently, and that's part and parcel of what I pointed to as SEPA's way of responding sensibly and creatively to the challenges are put to them. I mean, at the end of the day, within any budget, there have to be decisions made about where money comes from and what it's applied to. And that kind of decision-making process will then apply at every level. So all of the organisations need to have their own think, because they will get a sum of money, which they then have to look at and consider from their working priorities how they're going to make sure that is applied to deliver the best results. But, within the budget that we have at the moment, if I reinstate the money for research, you would have to tell me what other budget I took it from. Did I take it away from flooding? Did I take it away from... I mean, because these are the real decisions that have to be made in all of this.
In terms of explaining other changes in the budget, is the reduction in the Land Managers Renewables Fund driven simply by that priorities argument, valid as it is, or does it reflect demand?
No, that's because that in that particular one, that demand fell off substantially when the Westminster government changed the way it decided to deal with renewables. We argued against the changes, but they came down the road anyway. We'll continue to use the scheme to do what we can to increase renewables use on farms, but demand did fall off substantially. And there's little point maintaining a budget line if you know that it's not going to be taken up in that same way. Because all that happens at the end of the year is you either scrabble about trying to hold on to it when there are pressures coming from every direction, or somebody else helpfully points out where it could get sent to. So it's I mean, this is the reality of budgeting. So, you know, we've taken our best estimate, given the demand fall off, of what's actually going to be needed in that fund. And that explains the reduction in that one.
Okay.
But that was an externally driven decision.
Okay, just to get that on the record. Finlay Carson.
Cabinet Secretary, just on the back of the questions already gone ahead, surely the scientific evidence base should be critical to all the investment that's put into the budget thereafter. So we're looking at the marine budget, looking at the sustainable growth of sea fisheries, river assessments done, or salmon conservation done in our individual river assessment, to continue to support the sustainable growth of aquaculture, marine plans and so on. Surely we need the research there to inform how we then spend that budget.
Of course
we do.
So
are we not potentially spending money in areas that we shouldn't be because the baseline research is not there to show that it's being spent efficiently?
Well, if you've got examples of that, then please let me know what you think those examples are.
Well,
I mean,
could be...
The fact is that there is research spending going on across a whole range of, just in my portfolio, a whole range of issues. And the things that you're talking about, Marine Scotland will be involved in that, SEPA, SNH, you know, so it's not just, you know, one bit of the pot, and the research providers. So it's not one bit of the pot. But what we've had to do overall is make a decision about where we could trim a bit. Our view is that on research that can be done, but there will have to be, as I've already said, some prioritisation taken by those fund holders to consider what the most effective way to use what those funds are in terms of research. So there will have to be some, you know, clear lines drawn between the research that's instructed and the kind of practical outcome that you're talking about. They'll need to know that they're spending their money as wisely as possible to get the result they need.
I suppose the examples I'm looking at are the conflicts that there's been within the wild fisheries where you know, there's disputes whether the scientific evidence that's been used to set the river catch and release and so on, and also the conflict that has existed in the marine areas where different factions have got different ideas, and those issues could be taken away if there was more independent research. And I'm concerned that we still get a conflict because there's a perception that the independent research is not being done.
Is the conflict not that some people just disagree with the research that's been done, and that may continue to be the case regardless of who does the research? You know, in my experience, people take from research what suits their own arguments, and then the bits that they don't like, they decide they're going to argue against, regardless of how independent the research was. And, you know, I'm not sure that particular area is going to be any different to any other area in that regard. We could have spent 10 times as much on research and ended up with the same controversy.
Do you want to continue on with aquaculture?
I suppose we're back looking at SEPA, and Is there a risk that we might have additional cost recovery putting extra burden on industry because of the reduced funding that SEPA may have? So, for example, we've got water extraction costs for the trout fishing industry. Could we see potentially more costs put against industry because of the cuts potentially to the SEPA budget?
SEPA works very closely with the sector to raise the level of compliance. And, you know, 5 years ago when I was Minister for Environment, one of my responsibilities was aquaculture. And my experience with the industry was that they are as keen as anybody else to raise environmental standards because effectively it's the health of their product that suffers if the environmental standards are not kept as high as possible. So it's a direct benefit to their own industry and an investment in their own industry if they are also taking on some of the cost. And you know, industries of all kinds in all sectors, the length and breadth of the UK, will also be doing something similar in their areas. I'm not sure it is or should be different when it comes to aquaculture. But they're working very much in partnership with SEPA at the moment. The regulatory costs that SEPA has are principally paid for by regulated businesses. And that, of course, is aquaculture. So there's a strong incentive for the aquaculture companies to comply with the regulation, because as I indicated, it's the health of their product. I would have anticipated that any private company would want to invest in their product. This is a way of investing in their product.
Claudia Bemis come in with a supplementary.
Just to push that point a bit further, in that context, it's disappointing, Cabinet Secretary, that SEPA has shown that the pollution from aquaculture has actually worsened in the last tranche of reports. So I think, you know, that's something that, in terms of budgets,
which is why there's currently a big discussion and why SEPA and the industry are having to work together, because it doesn't help the industry any more than it helps the environment.
Sorry, Finlay Coss.
I suppose my example, or where my question was coming from, we can see, again, Scottish trout fishing fish farms where there is there's levels to come to, and they get tested 5 times a year or 10 times a year. If there's a plane of improvement, the charges are no less. I'm concerned that even though there is a desire in industry to improve, that the costs that SEPA apply to them don't decrease. And I'm concerned that these costs continue to rise to the detriment of the industry that do still want to improve.
Well, I'm sure SEPA will listen to that and consider the position. But remember, if we reduce income for SEPA from one direction, that will exacerbate the concerns that the committee is expressing about how they're going to manage in terms of future financial resources. So at the moment, that's factored into their budget. They'll need to make a decision about how they manage that, and that'll be perhaps one of the conversations that they're going to have as a result of the consultation. But I can't speak for SEPA in that regard.
Okay. Angus MacDonald.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Just to seek further clarification on SEPA, when we took evidence from SEPA a number of weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago, they told us that the proceeds from fines through the new Regulatory Reform Act weren't ring-fenced. Now, that doesn't tie in with what you said a short while ago in answer to an earlier question. And I'd certainly been under the impression that when the bill was going through Parliament, that SEPA would have the full proceeds from the fines that were imposed. Can we get some clarification on that? Because SEPA did tell us that the fines were going straight into the overall pot rather than than ring-fenced for SEPA.
But fines are different. I mean, fines are a different thing entirely. That's an enforcement penalty, and that's a different order of money. And yes, that does go into what's called the consolidated fund. And there will be other such penalties all get paid into that central fund. I think to go back to what Finlay was saying, that was actually very much welcomed by stakeholders, because it meant that there wasn't there wasn't an incentive for SEPA to start imposing fines over and above what was absolutely necessary, because if the fines became income, well, you know, you can see how that would become an issue. Yeah. I mean, I have to say that this is normal practice with fines. So whether you're talking about the Scottish courts or Revenue Scotland or anything else, this isn't any different to the way that that's managed. Fines, the penalties, are dealt with quite differently to, you know, the cost of regulation. They're not seen as a cost of regulation, because there would be a bit of a inbuilt hazard in all of that if they were.
Yeah, I appreciate the clarification.
Okay. Dave Stewart.
Thank you, how many staff will the Scottish Land Commission have?
I think we said we expected around about 20 in total. I think approximately up to 20. Sort of. That's the kind of ballpark figure. But that's all not going to happen all at once. I think there were 3 adverts this morning for staff. So it'll come in slowly over the period.
And what will the budget be for staff, and what budget heading will it be under?
The relevant budget is under land reform itself, and it's environmental services. I think, if I'm right, which I don't have, but oh, that's it there, right? Okay. Sorry. Yeah, but that's the.
Yeah, that's land reform under environment.
Under environment, right? Okay, so it's table 1004 in the published budget under environmental services. That land reform budget there is where it will come from. 1.4 million is to establish and run the Scottish Land Commission from the 1st of April out of the global total. And, you know, I'm grateful for the committee's work with the Land Commission commissioners and the Tenant Farming Commissioner, and that will now roll itself out.
And when all 20 staff are appointed, or around about 20, will they all be located in Longman House in Inverness, or would it be at different locations?
I don't know. I'm not sure it is budget related. We have said the Land Commission will be based in Inverness. I would have anticipated that the staff will be based in Inverness as well, but I'm a bit wary about making presumptions about that. I don't know. There may be some peripatetic staff. Who knows? I don't know, and I don't want to step in. It's not my job now to manage the Land Commission. It is the Land Commissioner's job to do that.
This committee intends to engage directly with the Land Commissioner on an ongoing basis, and we'll certainly be exploring that.
But, I mean, I'm assuming you welcome the fact that it's going to be in Inverness.
I've got the press release ready. And I hope I'm invited to the opening, but there may be some. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Mark Roscoe.
Just in terms of the Land Commission, does that anticipate the need for detailed legal advice as part of that budget? Because again, that was something that I think we uncovered, Convener.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
that's the budget for the Land Commission. Okay.
Right.
That will need to cover everything. That will need to you know, and that will obviously, that will obviously be looked at each year as the work progresses. This is an early stage, so the principal cost will be staffing and getting it up and running. I would have anticipated further down the line there might be questions about things like in-house versus externally commissioned work or whatever.
Okay. Can I just wrap this up by looking at impact to the budget? Earlier on, Cabinet Secretary, you didn't want to get into the detail of the Peatland Restoration funding. I understand the reasons behind that, but the predecessor committee to this one called for increased spend in this area. It would appear that call's been heeded, which is very, very welcome. I just want to tease out the implications of such a spend in 2017-18. If one accepts an average cost of £815 per hectare for peatland restoration, which I'm told is roughly what it is, that would have the potential to deliver a restoration of in excess of 12,000 hectares, which is about 3 times the current rate, with all the implications, positive implications for carbon sequestration and biodiversity. I mean, would you accept those kind of figures and agree that that would be a very welcome step forward in those terms?
We want to be ambitious about this. We are re-energising the whole initiative. I hope that that is reflected in the funding that is brought forward for it, but we do see it as a key component that covers a number of the issues that have been raised already by members here, both in biodiversity and climate change. So I am as optimistic as I can be, consonant with not stepping on anybody else's toes.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this morning, the time you've given us and the officials. Can I wish all of you a Merry Christmas when it comes?
Do I get a mince pie now?
We have other business to move on to, so I'll just allow a short time
Thank you.
the departure. Thank you. To consider 2 negative instruments. Those are the Tweed Regulation Salmon Conservation No. 2 Order 2016, SSI 2016/391, and the Conservation of Salmon Scotland Amendment Regulations 2016, SSI 2016/392. Full details of these negative instruments can be found in paper 3, to which I refer members. Can I invite any comments from members on these? Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to make brief comments and ask some questions which the committee might consider writing. I believe, would it be to the Cabinet Secretary to seek clarification
Indeed.
on? That is not on the Tweed SSI, and I welcome the positive conservation which is happening there. It's on the conservation of salmon amendments, the second one that you highlighted, and I would very much like to seek some sort of clarification on where we are with the EU possible infraction proceedings that came up previously in committee, in the Rural Affairs Committee in the last session, because that is a matter of concern. And just to highlight as well that there's still a Scotland-wide decline in salmon numbers. So while I welcome the more localised focus of the science and the data, which has enabled some movement on the gradings, I think it still needs to be highlighted that there are concerns. And for instance, although the Loch Lomond Association is pleased that theirs has been moved from 3 to 2, they're still highlighting that there can be improvements made to the methodology, and that there are concerns about fish predation by birds, and wonder if that has been considered by Marine Scotland. And the impact of salmon farms has also been highlighted to me. And finally, Convener, I'd just like to raise the issue which came up a lot in the previous evidence that we took over the previous SSI, which is about the Hafnetters in the Solway, and would like to mark the fact that there is now a scientific pilot there, which enables the continuation of the Hafnetters traditions. And they would like to highlight that it would be helpful if we could write to the Cabinet Secretary and ask if in the coming season the scientific evidence gathering could start on the 1st of May rather than later on, without in any way criticising Marine Scotland and others for what happened before. There were quite a lot of arrangements to make before, so they wanted to highlight that issue. But generally, a more positive result, but a lot more local data gathering, I think, should be highlighted to the Cabinet Secretary.
Okay.
So that's rather a long comment, but I've had quite a lot of information sent back to me on that issue.
I mean, there's two aspects to that, I think, from what you're saying. One is the bigger picture and where are we at with that. If we were to write the Cabinet Secretary, I'd perhaps want to add into that seeking an update on the latest science on seal predation of salmon numbers as well, which is something that came up in the last Parliament. And there is the localised matters that you've highlighted. Does anybody else wish to make a comment? Finlay Carson.
I don't know whether it's appropriate at this point, but what compensation is there for businesses, and can that be reviewed with regards to the banning of killing wild salmon, both in the estuary areas as well as the rivers? Is that something
I think it's noted, is it not, in the briefing papers that there is compensation being paid to netting interests, for example. Do you want some detail around what's being?
Yeah, because it would appear that it's based on weight of fish that's caught, not the potential return on actually processing that fish. So that the real compensation doesn't match what the loss there is to these businesses that are having their basically their livelihood taken away.
Okay, perhaps for perfectly valid conservation reasons, it has to be said. Any other comments?
I agree with Finlay, because I think we've obviously been speaking to the same people, because of the processing issue of compensation would seem to be more. So
are we agreed to take these points forward in a letter to the Cabinet Secretary as a committee? Yes. That being the case, do we also agree that the committee wishes to make no recommendations in relation to the instruments? We're agreed. Okay. Okay. At the next meeting of the committee on January the 10th, the committee will take evidence from stakeholders on the Scottish Government's Wildlife Crime in Scotland Annual Report 2015 and consider a draft report on the draft budget 2017-18. As agreed earlier, we will now move into private session. I ask the public gallery be cleared as the public part of the meeting is now closed.